Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Benefits of Reducing Sugar and Carbs Beyond Weight Loss. I'm Leslie Samay, Director of Professional Development at Great Valley Publishing, publishers of Today's Dietitian, and I'm the host for today's show. Before we get started, I have 3 points of housekeeping. In order to claim your credit, you'll have to remain with us for the entire hour-long presentation. Second, at the end of the session, our presenters will be taking questions. If you have a question, please type it into your Q&A box on the left-hand side of your screen, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. And finally, Simply Good Foods USA, Inc. was approved by the CDR to offer 1 CEU for this webinar. Simply Good Foods' vision is to lead the nutritional snacking movement with trusted brands like Atkins and Quest Nutrition that offer a variety of convenient, innovative, great-tasting, better-for-you snacks and meal replacements. Their mission is to empower healthy lives through smart and satisfying nutrition. To learn more, visit thesimplygoodfoodscompany.com. Today's presenters have the following relevant disclosures to report. Jonathan Clinthorne, PhD, is an employee of Simply Good Foods USA, Inc. Kristin Kirkpatrick, MSRD, is a consultant to Quest Nutrition and Jetson Health and a health coach for Prolon. The presenters certify that no conflict of interest exists for this program. So let's get started. Jonathan Clinthorne received his doctorate in human nutrition from Michigan State University for his work focusing on metabolism and immune function. He then completed his postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Colorado, Denver Anschutz Medical Campus, where he studied the interaction of diet, immunity, and the gut microbiota. Now, as the Director of Nutrition for Simply Good Foods USA, John's work is focused on sharing the numerous ways a low-carb or low-sugar lifestyle can promote everyday wellness. In addition, he's also responsible for managing relationships with researchers and healthcare professionals to help promote clinical evidence demonstrating the benefits of low-carbohydrate diets for managing obesity and diabetes. Kristin Kirkpatrick, MSRD, is the president of KAK Consulting, LLC, and she's a dietitian. She's a best-selling author, a dietitian at the Cleveland Clinic Department of Wellness and Preventive Medicine, an experienced presenter, and an award-winning dietitian. She's been seen on both local and national news shows such as The Today Show, NBC Nightly News, Fox News, CNN, and The Dr. Oz Show, and she's contributed to several national newspapers and magazines, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, Time, Runner's World, and in addition, she's a featured expert on Cleveland Clinic's Health Essentials. In her free time, she enjoys running, hiking, skiing, reading, and spending time with her husband, Andy, and her 2 sons, Jake and Bowden, and their dogs in their home outside of Denver, Colorado. And so with that, I'm pleased to turn it over to John and Kristin. Take it away.
Thank you, Leslie, and I'm really happy to be here. Appreciate the opportunity to get to talk on one of my favorite subjects. Here are our learning objectives for today, which you have all seen in the meeting invite. Just wanted to start off with a quick agenda to discuss what we're going to be talking about today. I really wanted to lead the conversation off just talking about the history of sugar and kind of helping people understand how our food system got to the place it is. And then also talk about some of the differences between free and added sugars and what the health implications of overconsumption of these kinds of sugars can be. Lastly, we're going to also move into how we reduce the glycemic load of the diet, what that actually means, what recent research has been published showing the benefits of reducing sugars and carbohydrates from the diet. And then Kristin's going to take us through how to coach clients, patients, and some case studies. So jumping right in, I think the first question we want to ask is, why do humans love sugar so much? And really, humanity has had a very long love affair with sugar. The sugarcane plant was originally found in the Ganges River back in about 400 AD, where it then kind of spread throughout the Middle East and Asia and became a highly sought after ingredient, really reserved for the elite up through about the 1700s. You can see this photo here. We have Queen Elizabeth I, also known as the Queen of Cavities, because of her overconsumption of sugar causing a lot of dental caries. And she was reported to have luxurious balls that would host all their participants, and they would have sculptures made out of sugar and swans and all sorts of exotic animals, all crafted from sugar. And she really is kind of that emphasis of how the elite really, really adopted their love of sugar. But then in the 1800s, it was discovered that the sugar beet was a great source of sucrose, which is table sugar. And with that discovery, sugar became much more affordable and accessible throughout the world. So now we have sugar consumptions that have reached massive quantities. And frankly, from a food science perspective, sugar actually has a lot of benefits to be used in foods. It gives baked goods great texture. It actually acts as a preservative in foods. It's relatively an affordable ingredient. It has great flavor, right? Humans love the flavor of sugar. We've evolved to appreciate that flavor. It's a signal to us that we're found a great energy source. So there's lots of reasons that sugar has really become proliferative in our food supply. Now, what is interesting is that back in the 1950s, 1960s, there was a lot of discussion around nutrition science, and this is really the infancy of nutrition science at the time, trying to understand not just metabolism of vitamins and minerals, but how dietary composition, the makeup of our entire diet, could influence our health outcomes. Specifically at the time, there was a lot of interest in heart disease. And for those of you who may be familiar with the diet-heart hypothesis that Ancel Keys promoted, that was really one paradigm that argued that saturated fat and cholesterol drove heart disease. There was actually a separate group of scientists who argued that it was the increasing consumption of refined carbohydrates and especially white sugar that was driving the epidemic of heart disease at the time. And so these two competing paradigms were actually being heavily debated in the scientific literature throughout the 50s, 60s, and into the early 70s. Now, ultimately, the paradigm of excessive fat consumption driving heart disease kind of won out. But some people argue that this was partially due to some tinkering by the sugar industry at the time, where they paid scientists to publish review papers talking about how fat really drove heart disease and downplayed the role of sugar in heart disease. And I think that's kind of interesting to us now, because I don't think anybody here would argue that sugar, overconsumption of sugar, is actually a driver in a lot of the negative health conditions that we suffer from. But nonetheless, the prevailing paradigm that really came out of all these discussions in the 70s was that we need to go to low-fat diets and try to eliminate saturated fat from the diet, which ultimately then pushed the U.S. diet towards a higher carbohydrate diet than it was originally. I love these slides because these go back, and the authors of this study actually looked at food availability data, consumption data, and looked at how the U.S. diet changed from the early 70s all the way up into the 2000s, and found that actually the U.S. increased its percentage of consumption of carbohydrates, decreased its consumption of fat, and protein stayed relatively stable throughout this time. And so many people would argue, okay, well, we've actually increased our carbohydrate intake, we've reduced our fat intake, we should have seen our health improve. But when you actually look at not just percent of calories, but what was actually changing in the diet, all that really happened was that the US population began to add more carbohydrates to the diet rather than make a full shift in the diet. And when they added more carbohydrates, they added several hundred grams, or they added several dozen grams of carbohydrates to their diet, much of that in the form of sugar and other processed carbs, which you can see here. I find these statistics to be so amazing when you look at them, with intakes of processed breakfast cereal and other things that contain a lot of refined carbohydrates, crackers, pretzels, corn chips, increasing by up to 200% over that 20-year period. Now, I think the other major driver, and this is really what a lot of the research has focused on, is the dramatic increase in sugar-sweetened beverages that has occurred throughout the last 50 years, with the total representation of calories almost doubling coming from sugar-sweetened beverages. Now, sugar-sweetened beverages represent about 200 calories per day of the US diet. And actually, if you look at data estimating where how the obesity rates have developed in the United States, it's really about 200 calories extra a day that is driving a lot of the obesity epidemic in the United States. One of the big things that has increased the accessibility and affordability of sugar-sweetened beverages is the relative proliferation of liquid sugars, especially high fructose corn syrup. In the 70s, that represented about 1% of caloric sweeteners, and now it's up to 42% in the United States. So really a big driver of dietary changes in our population. You also see that by the increasing consumption of high fructose corn syrup, which is demonstrated in this graph here, these dotted lines represent the percent of calories coming from two different sources, the dotted line being high fructose corn syrup and the solid line being whole grains, that whole grains dramatically decreased, and this was largely replaced by calories coming from high fructose corn syrup. Now, you can imagine that if the number of calories coming from high fructose corn syrup was to start replacing those coming from whole grains, there's also another macronutrient that starts to disappear from the diet, and that is dietary fiber. So there's other data that's been published showing that not only did our sugar intake increase and our whole grain intake decrease, but this coincided with a dramatic decrease in the amount of dietary fiber that the population was consuming. A very important nutrient for many different health concerns and preventing a lot of diseases. I do think it's important to take a moment to discuss the different types of sugars, the different classes of sugars that exist. So sugars can be described by their chemical nature, whether they're monosaccharides, disaccharides, or polyols, or they can be classified as free sugars and added sugars. And it's really these free sugars and added sugars that we're going to concentrate on today. So free sugars is a larger category that encompasses pretty much all monosaccharides and disaccharides that might be added to the foods, but also those naturally present in foods. So that would include things like honey, maple syrup, or even sugars found in fruit juice. Whereas added sugars are really those that are not naturally occurring in the food, but are added by food manufacturers or people when they're creating recipes that dramatically increase the amount of sugar. And it's really these added sugars that seem to be the biggest driver of a lot of the health concerns in the US, although there is some data showing that just overconsumption of free sugars in general is also an issue, but really I want everyone to kind of understand that it's the added sugars that are big issues within our population. When you actually look at consumption of sugars and energy balance, there are kind of two competing paradigms right now around what are driving the obesity rates, diabetes rates, as diabetes is largely connected to obesity and other health concerns. And we really have the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity, which argues that it's the overconsumption of high glycemic index sugars and starches that drive insulin secretion, ultimately promoting fat storage. And this paradigm argues that you're changing the hormonal environment within the body that stimulates us to be more predisposed to storing energy, suppressing metabolism, really putting us into a fat storage state. Conversely, there's also the energy balance model of obesity. And the energy balance model of obesity argues that sugars, in combination with other highly palatable ingredients, fat and salt, really stimulate appetite in the population. And by stimulating appetite, this causes the overconsumption of foods, and energy intake begins to outweigh energy expenditure, leading to obesity. Now, while these two paradigms are competing really to see whose research is going to win out for the bigger driver of obesity in the US, to me, this is almost less important, because one thing we see in common with both of these is that it's these highly processed sugars that drive energy consumption, that drive overconsumption of foods, and drive energy balance to become out of whack. So really, to me, it's kind of like, who cares who wins? We've identified some really problematic things in the diet, and how do we go about adjusting for those things? Why would sugars be so harmful when we're talking about dietary patterns? And there's a lot of data that's been published, and we'll talk about some of this, but there's actually mechanistic data that's started to identify how these added sugars and overconsumption of sugars can damage different organ systems, whether we're talking about the brain and overconsumption of sugar altering dopamine dynamics in the hippocampus, or we're talking about how excessive glycemia, high blood sugar, chronic high blood sugar can damage our arteries, can overstress pancreatic beta cells, or even just the fact that sugars, especially sugar-sweetened beverages, have really low satiety per calorie. There's a lot of reasons that overconsumption of sugar can be driving various health problems. And there's actually a ton of data that links the overconsumption of sugar to various negative health outcomes. And so this was a large umbrella review that was published in BMJ a little while ago, where they did a scoping review of all the studies that have been published showing associations. Now, again, we're talking about association, not causation here, but associations between excessive intake of added or free sugars, depending on the type of study they were looking at, and cancer outcomes, cardiovascular outcomes, showing that excessive intake of added sugars was linked to especially specific cancers like pancreatic cancer or prostate cancer in men, or that excessive consumption of sugars was linked to gout or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So really quite a large body of data at this point. And I think that's really promising when you start to look at making policy recommendations, is that we do have a lot of evidence that shows this association. And now I'm going to pass it over to Kristin, and she's going to take us through a little bit of the data around nutrition and brain health, especially related to sugars.
Thank you so much, Dr. John. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I'm so excited to talk about this component because when I was in dietetic school, it was really all about the physical health, helping someone who had heart disease, cancer. If you've been to dietetic school, you understand what I'm saying, but very rarely did we hear anything about the mental health component. Even though we may have covered brain, mental health was just not in the limelight the way other physical conditions were. So there's this whole realm of thinking now called nutritional psychology or nutritional psychiatry. And I actually have a lot of patients that I just see for nutritional psychology. So it's really interesting to look at this and where some of the data is on this. I think number one, what we need to establish is that in the world of nutritional psychology, we need more evidence. We need more randomized controlled trials that are high quality. We need that because we need to understand the mechanistic underlying. Right now, what we have is that we really need more to show more causality. So if you look at this slide, it's really looking at the fact that we don't have causality in nutrition and brain health as it relates to mental health, and that's what we need more of. So we know that, for example, if we look at the chicken and an egg approach, to use that term, someone who has depression, we have studies showing that they might not eat very well. They might be focused on more highly processed foods. They might be focused on fast food consumption. We see that. We also know that someone who is having those foods might also suffer depression. But what we don't understand is that underlying mechanism. So we definitely need to know more information within this area. Despite that, we still have a lot of data, as Dr. John had said. So we've got some really good information looking at trauma, looking at depression, and looking at anxiety in general. So we look at this slide here. This is looking at one of the studies that looked at the increased likelihood for having depression based on sugar consumption. So sugar intake, definitely looking at the increased depression risk. And what were the mechanisms that they found in this study? Well, it could be that we're looking at some postprandial hyperglycemia, maybe some addiction-like effects of sugar influencing neurotransmitters. And I know there's some debate on that. Is sugar addiction actually a thing? I saw a question on that. And then the link between sugar intake and low mood. So those are some of the mechanisms that we believe might be seen in some of these studies that are impacting it. And of course, all of these things are really relatable, and you're going to see this in a lot of my slides, to the glycemic index. So when we look at this concept of the glycemic index, we know that this is something that shows us how foods affect our blood sugar and our insulin. Glycemic index and glycemic load were originally just programmed really to look at diabetics and how do we identify what foods were the best options for our diabetes patients in terms of overall insulin and in terms of their blood sugar management. So when we think about glycemic index, a lot of times I have my patients saying, well, just tell me what I don't want to look at a specific diet. It's too overwhelming. I don't know where to get information. What's one thing I can look at in terms of my overall mental health? Glycemic index tends to be something that can be really beneficial from that component. So, and glycemic load obviously is going to be another one that we can look at as well. All right, I think I'm turning back over to Dr. John to look at the mechanistic approach for glycemic index.
Yeah, thank you, Kristin. One of the things that I think is really important when we're looking at research is we see a lot of associations, but we also have to identify, is there a mechanism behind this association that makes it believable? We call this biological plausibility. So is there biological plausibility that reducing the glycemic load of the diet might actually benefit various health conditions? And one of those things is that by reducing the glycemic load of the diet, you actually decrease de novo lipogenesis, which is really the liver creating fat from the excessive sugar and carbohydrates that are coming in. So certainly there's biological plausibility that by reducing the glycemic load of the diet, you could actually improve blood lipids. When it comes to mitochondrial function, which is related to then our energy levels, our brain function, there's been evidence showing that fructose actually decreases ATP production in the mitochondria in the liver, which could lead to fatigue and other types of liver issues. And then when it's related to glycemia, I think this is probably one of the clearest pathways forward. Eating a lot of sugar drives up blood sugar, chronically stressing the pancreatic beta cells, chronically requiring a lot of insulin to be secreted, driving hyperinsulinemia. So certainly reducing that glycemic load will ultimately help improve glycemia. We'll talk about a study that's shown this. And then when we're looking at other cardiovascular risk factors beyond just dyslipidemia, excessive sugar creating advanced glycation end products in the bloodstream can drive inflammation, can drive endothelial cell dysfunction. There's been some studies looking at arterial stiffness and showing that excessive sugar consumption can increase arterial stiffness, whereas lower glycemic eating seems to ameliorate that effect. So a lot of good mechanistic support for some of the stuff we're going to talk about. But I always want to take a minute and help everyone understand the difference between the glycemic index and the glycemic load. So the glycemic index was something that was created, as Kristin said, a measure of how does a certain food impact your blood sugar. And what's very specific about it is that it's an index. So you're always comparing the food that you're talking about to glucose. How does that food impact your blood sugar compared to glucose? And essentially, it's ranked on a scale of against 100, with glucose being a 100. So you feed people the food, measure their blood sugar response, feed people pure glucose, and measure their blood sugar response. And in order to accurately capture an index, you need to use a standard amount of available carbohydrate from a food. So in this case, you have to feed people exactly 50 grams of available carbohydrate from that food, which could be a lot of food or a little bit of food, in order to get to that 50 grams of available carbs. And so that's what the glycemic index is. Now, the problem with glycemic index is that most foods by themselves don't contain exactly 50 grams of available carbohydrates. So the glycemic load was actually created to account for these differences in serving size. So this is really about how fast your blood sugar rises and how much glucose is delivered by that food when that food is digested. And you can actually have very high glycemic index foods, things like watermelon, that because a serving size of watermelon actually contains so few carbohydrates, its glycemic load is actually very low. And so you can calculate the glycemic load of any food by taking the glycemic index of that food times the amount of available carbohydrates in a serving of that food and dividing it by 100. And that will get you your glycemic load of the food. So this is a very important concept, because when we're talking about low glycemic eating, what are we talking about? We're actually talking about the overall glycemic load of the diet, rather than talking about just eating lower glycemic index foods. Because if you eat a lot of low glycemic index foods, you may still have a high glycemic load diet. And I think this is really important to understand when you start to look at the research that's been done on glycemic loads. Now, I don't want to completely drain this slide. There's a lot of words. But I think what's really important are these two columns on the right, looking at how the researchers who are looking at lower glycemic load diets as forms of intervention in various studies have defined that low glycemic load diet. You have some that actually total up the entire glycemic load of the diet and say, okay, it needs to be less than 125 grams. Now, there's no standard definition for a day of eating in low glycemic load. You've seen other researchers say, well, the low glycemic load diet that we fed our study participants had a glycemic load of 51. And other people actually choose to define it as the percent of energy available from carbohydrates when eating lower glycemic index foods. So still making sure you're accounting for that serving size of the food, because if you keep your diet as 35 or 40% of energy from carbohydrate, you actually will not be able to overconsume a lot of those lower glycemic index foods. And what I find really interesting is that when you start to talk about restricting percent of energy from carbohydrate intake, you'll see that there's actually a lot of overlap between what people traditionally call low carbohydrate diets and low glycemic load diets. Now, all low carbohydrate diets essentially are going to be low in their glycemic load, but not all low glycemic load diets are going to be low carbohydrate diets. I know that's a little bit of a tongue twister there to think about, but so we're going to kind of talk a little bit about both low glycemic load diets and low carbohydrate diets as a form of low glycemic load diets as we go through here. I hope that that kind of clears up some of the confusion that often exists around low glycemic eating. And we're then going to transition now from kind of this background information to diving into some of the studies that are out there. I'm going to hand it back over to Kristin to talk about some of this data.
Thanks, Dr. John. So when we look at this concept of low glycemic load diet and we look at the association of a high glycemic load, we know that we have an association with higher depressive symptoms, mood disturbances, fatigue compared to a low glycemic load diet, especially when we look at these in overweight or obese individuals. So not to jump to a different topic, but there is some mention in a lot of these studies on how this also affects the gut microbiome as well, and how that overall affects mental health, because that's a huge component of mental health as well. So we know that dietary pattern plays a large role here. And Dr. John said it really well, that not every low carbohydrate diet is the same as a low glycemic load diet. So when I think about that from my patients, I think about the concept of, let's say, the Mediterranean diet. Mediterranean diet is definitely something lower on the glycemic load. A lot of it has to do with the components in the foods that are in a Mediterranean diet, specifically things like fiber. This is a study looking at low glycemic load breakfast and how it could help really bring down cognitive impairment. And I think that's an important point to bring as well. When I'm working with patients or I'm presenting on nutritional psychology, one of the things I talk about a lot is anything that will benefit the brain, anything that will bring down inflammation in the brain should really overall help with overall mental health outcomes. So we can look at this concept of how glycemic load might interact with inflammatory factors in the brain. We can look at adipokines, which are, of course, cytokines produced by adipose tissue. And they are involved in inflammation and obesity. So there's a lot of information that we can get on that. But Mediterranean diet in general, lower in the glycemic load, and also tends to be really beneficial in terms of the benefits to overall mental health, but also really looking at overall benefits to brain health as well. This was a study looking at Mediterranean diet, one that was rich in extra virgin olive oil and associated with higher levels of plasma antioxidant capacity. So when we look at this Mediterranean style diet, and we also look at perhaps bringing down the carbs a little bit. So, and again, in my patient base, and we'll go through some case studies, but in my patient base, especially when I see anxiety, depression, and we're working with a therapist alongside that or a psychologist, a lot of times we'll look at a moderate to low carbohydrate Mediterranean approach as one of the best factors in really looking at those mental health outcomes. And this is just one study that relates to that as well. I'm going to turn it back to Dr. John to talk about further glycemic control.
Thanks, Kristin. Yeah, I'm always fascinated by the fact that the Mediterranean diet is actually a little bit lower in carbohydrates than most people expect. And when you look at other studies of low carbohydrate diets, especially when we're talking about things beyond weight loss, There was this study that was just published in the JAMA journal in 2022 by a group at Tulane, where they were looking at the effects of a low carbohydrate dietary intervention on HbA1c, essentially glycemic control, in a patient population who had high risk of developing diabetes because their HbA1c was somewhere between 6 and 6.9. So not officially considered to have type 2 diabetes, but at a very high risk of developing diabetes. And what's also really interesting about this study is that by recruiting in New Orleans, the greater Louisiana, New Orleans area, they actually had about 60% of their participants as African Americans, which is an underrepresented portion of the population in nutrition research. Now, the goal of this study was to reduce net carbohydrates for 3 to 6 months and look at how that would improve blood sugar control. There were no calorie goals, calorie reduction, or weight loss goals intended, and they really wanted to measure the results of this trial against the diabetes prevention program trials, which have been published and are well known for their ability to reduce the progression of prediabetes into diabetes. And so the researchers were hoping to achieve a 0.17 net reduction in HbA1c as comparable to that DPP program. Why I chose this study to highlight is they actually did this thing in the study where they totaled up the participants' glycemic load of their diets. And so you can see here we've got that highlighted, and the people on the low carbohydrate arm had a glycemic load of 26 on their daily diet at 3 months, and then 34 at 6 months. And what I also think is really remarkable when you look at this intervention is that the added sugar consumption dropped off a cliff for these folks. You see added sugars, 9 grams of added sugar a day at 3 months and 11 grams of added sugar a day at 6 months. And this is in the low carbohydrate arm compared to the usual arm, which also got dietary counseling, but was encouraged to really follow more of a dietary guidelines type of approach. They also saw that sugar sweetened beverage consumption dramatically decreased. And if we really think about the problems in the US diet, this is addressing a lot of those problems. Added sugars and sugar sweetened beverages are really removed from the diet. So they had great diet records from this study, so we can really look at what people were actually eating. Now, when we look at the results of this study, we saw a change in hemoglobin A1c of 0.23%. Remember, they were shooting for that 0.17%. So they actually saw a great improvement in hemoglobin A1c and more significant in that low carbohydrate arm. They also reported improvements in the homeostatic model of insulin resistance, which really essentially looking at insulin sensitivity and saying that insulin sensitivity improved when people were eating this lower carbohydrate, low glycemic load diet, and improvements in fasting insulin and body weight as well, even though they weren't trying to actually change body weight with this study. Now, the authors did comment that it becomes difficult to disentangle whether the effects of this lower glycemic, lower carbohydrate diet were due to the weight loss or were due to simply the actual dietary changes. So I think the great follow-up to that is a study that was done by a group at Ohio State University where they asked this very question, that if we keep participants' weight stable and feed them a variety of different diets, and then we can look at what metabolic changes happen in these folks. And this study must have been very, very challenging to conduct because they had to keep people weight stable, and they did what's called a randomized crossover trial, where each person does each arm of the diet, whether it's the low carbohydrate arm, which is about 6% of energy from carbohydrates, a moderate carbohydrate arm, which was about 30% of energy from carbohydrates, or the high carbohydrate arm, which is about 60% of energy from carbohydrates. Now, each person was randomized into each different intervention at different times. So not everyone went low carb, moderate carb, high carb. A lot of people would have gone high carb, low carb, moderate carb, or whatever. And then they washed out between the arms to let everyone go back to their original diet, and then they would re-intervene. So the results of this study are quite amazing, keeping everyone weight stable. They recruited people who were obese, but still had metabolic syndrome, indications of metabolic issues, prediabetes. And what they found was that when people were on the low carbohydrate arm, out of the 16 participants who were enrolled, 9 of them actually no longer had metabolic syndrome present. When people were put into that moderate carbohydrate arm, 3 of them no longer had metabolic syndrome present. And on that higher carbohydrate arm, 57% of energy coming from carbohydrates, only 1 person saw their metabolic syndrome go away. So this is a very good sign that some of the effects of low carbohydrate, low glycemic in eating, because remember that moderate carbohydrate arm would still be very congruous with a low glycemic, low diet. Can they see these effects even in the absence of weight loss, which I think is very powerful because frequently people are very discouraged when they change their diet and they don't see the pounds come off. But what this shows is that you still might have a lot of metabolic benefits. And you also might see changes on the inside that you can't see on the outside, such as that to your liver, which I think Kristin's going to talk about next.
I love talking about the liver. And I think one of the reasons why this is so important, so I went back one slide by accident, sorry, is because we have a huge population of our patient base as dietitians and health practitioners that are dealing with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which, by the way, the nomenclature has now changed, and I'll talk about that in just a few slides. So let's start with just the defining factor of NAFLD, which is lipogenesis. So I always tell my patients the liver is such an amazing organ. It's involved in blood sugar management. It acts as a reservoir to both storing glucose and releasing it when the body needs it for energy. But of course, what happens when there's too much sugar that can't be used for energy, the liver becomes overwhelmed. And it becomes to store excess sugar as fat, ultimately replacing healthy liver cells with fat cells. So we know that some fat in the liver is normal, but it begins to suffer when we have those loss of that healthy liver cells. And eventually the healthy liver tissue is replaced with too much fat. The fat occupies the liver, and you now have this non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and all of the different stages that go along with it. Lipogenesis is, of course, defined as the synthesis of fatty acids from those non-lipid precursors. So it is that pathway that defines the feature of NAFLD. And I know in my patient practice, a lot of times I'll have someone who will come to see me, and they'll just say, well, I just thought fat in your liver or any kind of liver damage was caused by too much alcohol. I think there's still this disassociation between really looking at whether or not we've got sugar that could impact the liver. And so this is why I always start with the fact that sugar is really hugely impacting the liver, because anything that's impacting the liver will, of course, be impacting, resulting in things like insulin resistance and things like that. So we do have a new fatty liver nomenclature. So this was really interesting to me. I've got 2 liver books out. And the hepatologist that I wrote my latest book with, he contacted me one day and he says, well, it's happened. We've got this new nomenclature for liver. And so there's a lot of reasons why we have seen this, and there's a study on this as well. Number one, we look at how we identify patients. So when a patient comes to us, we're going to look at, of course, the liver enzymes, things of that nature. We're going to look at their dietary factors. But really the new nomenclature is encompassing patients who have really that steatosis, that fat in the liver, inflammation, and have at least 1 of 5 cardiometabolic risk factors. So looking at all the components associated with that. The other reason they decided to take away the original nomenclature of NAFLD was that they found it to be stigmatizing, and they couldn't do it a patient identification. So this was why we looked at this new nomenclature, now looking at something called MET-ALD. And those with MET-ALD, again, you can look at consumption of alcohol, but really it's looking at what is the insulin resistance. That's one of those cardiometabolic factors. And then what is the association of the staging of the patient as well. So staging is really important. When we look at staging, the reason it's important as practitioners, and especially for me as a dietitian, is that the first 3 stages are very reversible. So we've got the healthy liver that you can see here. We now have fatty liver. That's when that fat deposit starts replacing healthy liver tissue. Once we get into fibrosis, it's becoming a little bit more challenging, right? We've got a little bit more inflammatory factors going on, but still reversible. But once the liver is completely replaced, then we have a cirrhotic liver. And then you're looking at this idea of having to look at a liver transplantation in order to be able to reverse it. The first 3 stages, we know that there are dietary modifications, reducing sugar, reducing that glycemic load. Many of my patients are following that Mediterranean low-carb approach. That all shows to be very powerful in reversing non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. But of course, once we get to those later stations. And then we actually had a study coming out about 2 weeks ago that we don't have in the slides here because it's so new, looking at the incidence of liver cancer and sugar-sweetened beverages. So just looking at having 1 to 2 sugar-sweetened beverages a day, whether that was cola or juice, and how that increased the risk for liver cancer. We also know that children are highly affected by NAFLD. So when I look at the progression, one of the things I say to my patients is that on the flip side of benefit, if we could look at that, the first 3 stages, so looking at really getting into fibrosis and getting into the inflammation, everything before cirrhosis, it takes time. These things take time. And so we have a good amount of time to be able to reduce the damage, to be able to reverse the disease. And this is one of the problems that we see, though, with children, that they have a really long time to be able to form into that cirrhotic liver, to liver cancer, et cetera. So we've seen a huge increase in children and adolescents from 19.34 million in 1990 to 29.49 million in 2017. Massive increase in looking at kids and the existing diagnosis of NAFLD. So when we compared in this study the effect of a low sugar diet with usual diet, what we saw was really great benefit in terms of reducing some of the symptoms and some of the diagnostic factors that we have for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease as well. Okay, comparing a low carbohydrate, high fat diet versus a low fat diet on type 2 diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. This was another study that I look at a lot with my patient base, really looking at replacing carbohydrates with lower carbohydrates. And what I focus on this one is really looking at quality. So in this study, we're looking at low carb diet, 20% of calories coming from carbohydrates. And what we're really looking at is the fact that fat is a little bit higher in this. Again, the fact that my patients sometimes say, well, alcohol is the only thing that impacts the liver. We know that's not the case. They also might think, well, fat must be the only thing that really impacts the liver because you're telling me that fat increases in the liver can cause this condition. Again, not the case, as Dr. John has shown in the studies prior. So really looking at the benefit of not really counting calories here from this study, but just looking at that low carbohydrate approach and looking at a higher fat percentage as well. Okay, let's look at the implementation of what this all means. I saw in the questions here about 20 minutes ago, someone asking whether or not there was an actual thing called food addiction or sugar addiction. So I want to go to a study, a survey rather, that was done by the University of Michigan. I did a lot of interviews on this when it came out because I think it's something we do not see in the psychological manuals right now. So we don't have food addiction there, but what the University of Michigan study did was really look at 4 defining factors of what could be looked at as addiction. Intense craving being one of them. So thinking about that bag of potato chips, thinking about those cookies. I have those cravings. I just got to tap into those cravings. I can't take it anymore. The inability to cut down on highly processed foods, despite the negative consequences. And I think the negative consequences is a key factor here. So I have these cravings. I really want to eat all these potato chips instead of having a piece of fruit. Let's use that as an example. And I know that the negative consequence will be that my blood sugar will go up. I'm more prone to chronic conditions. My mental health might be impacted. I don't care. Those are the negative consequences. I'll deal with it, right? So that's the other component. Signs of withdrawal is another one. So in the survey, if you were to look at that, they did say that it takes sometimes between 3 to 6 weeks. And withdrawal could be just mood disturbances, things of that nature, and then a loss of control over intake. I start eating a potato chip from that bag, and before you know it, the bag is gone. So what they compared to when they looked at this survey was really looking at nicotine, and they saw more association with nicotine addiction than they did alcohol addiction. But when we look at whether or not there is such a thing as food addiction, we don't have it in the psychological manuals, but I think that these 4 defining features are really, really important to look at. Okay, let's look at a few case studies here. So I've obviously changed the names, but these are real patients that I've had. Kelly is an individual who never cooked, So she was not a fan of cooking and told me, do not make me cook. I won't do it. So that was an actual quote out of her mouth. She was always on a diet of some sort. So she would figure out what her friends were doing, and then she would get onto that diet. Of course, she would lose weight and then gain it right back and fall into this yo-yo effect. She liked fruit. That was really the only thing that she had in her diet that had nutrient density, but for the most part really falls into a Western dietary pattern. So highly processed foods, lots of fast food, very low nutrients. And then in conjunction, she was also in therapy for depression, anxiety, and trauma. So definitely a nutritional psychology case. Slight elevation, hemoglobin A1C, but she was not pre-diabetic, although it had been going up every 3 months because she had been tested at that time. And then non-celiac gluten intolerance and lactose intolerance as well. So we had a few challenges to deal with there as well. The action plan. So number one, I think this is really important. I did work, of course, in conjunction with her mental health professional. In this case, she was working with a therapist. And I think that's a really important component. If we're going to talk about nutritional psychology, we have to realize that I always say we are just the little cherry on top of the therapy sundae. We can help the patients find better outcomes, but the therapist is really going to provide the magic in terms of the psychological approach. I also suggested moderate carbohydrate diet, adding in more fruits because she likes that, and then replacement of hyperpalatable options with more nutrient-dense options, some examples of which you can see there. Establishing new habits. So she did agree to walk a little bit more. We do obviously see associations between moderate physical activity, even light physical activity and well-being. She decided that she would agree to intermittent fasting. So she was doing 16 hours fasted, and that tended to help, especially that hemoglobin A1C. She still was not in favor of cooking. That's the truth. But she did work with us to find a food delivery service, and that tends to be really great for her. So I think that's the other thing as dietitians, really finding out, hey, what are some of those great food delivery services that might work for patients who simply are not going to cook, but we still want them to avoid going to fast food places. As you can see, her results were really, really, really well received here. So in 3 months, she went from lowered carbohydrates to low to moderate carbohydrate consumption. Her depression scores reduced. Her sleep quality improved. We do see a huge association with sleep quality, mental health, and diet. She completely eliminated alcohol, and that was a big factor as well. By 6 months, her hemoglobin A1C had really significantly reduced, depression scores more significant, and she actually went 50% vegetarian. So I thought that was really interesting. That was not one of our primary goals, but that was something that she was able to really focus on. John was another patient of mine. Now, John did not have the mental health aspect, but he did have fatty liver, which was diagnosed with liver enzymes on his blood work, and then subsequent ultrasound showing that fibrosis. So John's already into that second stage by the time that he saw me, 40-inch waist, and considered pre-diabetic based on his hemoglobin A1C. Also, his ratio of HDL and LDL was not well, so he had some lipid profile issues going on. A lot of sweetened beverages and refined stripped carbohydrates. So physically demanding job. John was in construction, and he would basically go to the carts every day and just get non-nutrient food. So he would get hot dogs, and he would get a donut for breakfast. Also loved fruit, but did not like vegetables. So that's kind of the outline for John. These are things that were common in John's diet. So getting that fast food, that was almost daily for him, especially on the construction site. He loved dried fruits. So he told me he loved fruit, but a lot of it was dried. So again, the sugar concentrations going up, a lot of sweetened beverages, and just general candy. I would say that John was, had some addictive nature to candy as well. I also put him on a moderate to low carbohydrate Mediterranean dietary intervention, 25 to 40% high quality carbohydrates. He started switching that donut for steel cut oats in the morning, started agreeing to having some starchy vegetables, small amounts of brown rice. This all took time, of course. And then the real huge factor here was the reduction of sugar sweetened beverages. which was challenging for him, but we really worked really hard to maintain that. Also looked at a 25% protein coming from fatty fish, poultry, and beans, and he still had a little bit of red meats, and then 30% healthy fats. So he improved a lot of different factors there, and his blood work and his waist circumference really did show that. As you can see, at 12 months, his waist circumference went down to 35 inches. His ALT and AST were within normal range, just within a 12-month period. Remember, John was in that fibrosis stage. He had signs of fibrosis. So that was really huge for him. He learned how to eat fruit and dark chocolate as his sugar instead of some of those gummy bears that John really loved to eat as well. So again, a lot of hard work, mainly with the sugar sweetened beverages. That was his biggest challenge. But just an example of what two different patients might look like, one from the nutritional psychology side with high glycemic load diet, and another with the NAFLD side, also high glycemic load. When alterations were made to that, carbohydrates were lowered, we saw some really huge improvements over time. I'm going to put it back to John now to put our conclusions together.
Thanks, Kristin. I always love hearing you talk about your patients. It's so enlightening for those of us on the research side of things. So I just wanted to conclude, I think it's pretty clear that a lot of the metabolic health crisis that the U.S. is facing has a strong association to the increasing intake of free and added sugars. I don't think many people out there would argue that. But what we see is that the biggest drivers of those overconsumption of sugar seems to be sugar sweetened beverages and the other really high glycemic index, highly refined carbohydrate foods that are pretty common in the standard American diet at this point. Now, we have a lot of data that suggests this association, right? We see people who consume these types of foods have these higher risks of developing these diseases, or not all these conditions that we've talked about have randomized controlled trials to show that if you intervene by reducing the glycemic load, you do see a benefit. I just want to be clear on that. Now, I think that still, when we have a lot of this strong association data, it's a pretty good basis to program your intervention or your research study around, but it is very important to note. But also in conclusion, there's lots of research around the fact that there are a variety of ways to reduce the glycemic load of the diet. Moderate carbohydrate restriction that focuses on eating lower glycemic index and lower glycemic load diets, that's been shown to be really effective for multiple health conditions with those randomized control trials. And again, with randomized control trials kind of being on the top of our evidence pyramid, I think that's going to be the thing we need to rely on. And then as Kristin showed, coaching patients and clients really requires this individualized nutrition approach where maybe the core philosophy of that approach, getting added sugars out, focusing on eating more fiber-rich vegetables or fruits, getting really nutrient-dense foods into the diet, it's all kind of the same, but the way that it's presented to the patient and the patient is coached through it seems to change based on the individual's needs. So with that, I think we've got some time for questions. Leslie, would you mind taking it away and asking us some of the questions that came in the chat?
Absolutely. That was great, guys. Thank you so much. So starting at the top and working our way down, first for Dr. John, I believe, from Krista. In terms of managing a consistent carb or low-carb diet, can you define net carbs? This came up a couple times from a few other listeners. How does net carbs compare when you look at total carbs? And sort of the overall message here, I think, from the listeners is the less math that they have to give to patients and clients, the better.
Yeah, certainly. In our day and age of convenience, we need easy tools and easy recommendations. So I think when you look at a lot of these studies, you can just start with the overall level of carbohydrate intake. Like if you were to say, hey, follow a more moderate carbohydrate intake, approximately 130 grams of carbs a day, you'll see that people will generally improve their diet quality quite a bit. Now, the one benefit for focusing on net carbs is that you start to get foods that are, I'm not going to say quote unquote free foods, because they're really fiber rich. So when you subtract your fiber from your total carbs, then you get net carbs. And so essentially it's encouraging vegetable intake, encouraging portions of whole grains and fruit that are rich in fiber. There's also the common question about sugar alcohols. what I would say to sugar alcohols is there's research showing that most sugar alcohols are relatively metabolic inert and can also be subtracted from that total carbohydrate number to get you to your net carbs.
Awesome. Okay. All right, Kristin, this one is for you from Kayla. How can focusing on sugar negatively impact the mental health of people who have eating disorders or struggle with disordered eating and similar not conditions, but low socioeconomic status, maybe low literacy level, things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kayla. And I just want to say one quick thing too, just because Dr. John was talking about the net carbs. One thing I say to my patients too is always have foods that have competition for digestion. So don't give yourself just sugar. Make sure the fiber's there. That creates competition for digestion. That's the term I use for my patients. That seems to go well. Let's go back to the mental health question about sugar negatively impacting individuals. Especially those with disordered eating, anorexia, or even orthorexia. This is a great question. This came up early on in my career with working with this population. And it's actually really not as relatable to individuals that have disordered eating. I actually, over time, had to come to realize that. But I worked with a lot of dietitians and health professionals that just were working with individuals that had anorexia specifically and bulimia. So those were two that were working with the center that I was working with. And they had actually said to me, please do not talk about nutritional psychology with these patients. Like, just let's make sure that when we're presenting, those patients are not in the room, et cetera. So it really is not relatable, nutritional psychology, to them as well, because it could create more challenges with what they're going through already. And that could, of course, be brought up with the socioeconomic factors as well. Sugar is cheap. The foods with those things are cheap. So that's kind of two different questions. But I wouldn't really relate nutritional psychology principles to disordered eating. And again, I've had about 5 years of experience working with people in that area. And even when I present, the first thing I say is this is not a presentation for anyone working with someone who's got anorexia, bulimia, et cetera. So that's a little bit outside of the realm of this. For the socioeconomic question, I really think that this is all about education. So I used to joke that when we talk about food on a budget, all dietitians bring up how cheap beans are. But the fact of the matter is, like, most people don't know how to cook beans. And so really the role that I try and take is, well, how can we get beans, something that's still cheap, in a way that's a little bit more still affordable but easy to use? So vacuum packed, or even in a can, and then teaching how we reduce sodium if we're going to get a canned option. That's more realistic. So that's really the approach that I take. What's the realistic nature of how we can make these suggestions to patients and give them things that they actually can do? And I always say that there's one thing we talk about in this mental health world, which is shame and vulnerability. And I always tell my patients, do not have shame about the fact that you're going to buy frozen foods or canned foods. Let me work with you to give you the best options if you're going to get those things. And we can really avoid a lot of sugar by having some of those foods and knowing how to buy them as well.
Fantastic. Awesome answer. Okay, this one's for both of you from Bettina. How do your suggestions throughout the last, say, 50 years compare to a whole food plant-based diet? There's evidence, of course, that we know of that there's benefits to these types of diets, although they tend to be high in carbs. So, Dr. John, I'll start with you on that one, and then Kristin, you can chime in.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, a very valid question. I think one of the things that we're saying here is that these types of diets are a tool in the toolbox. So I don't think we're arguing this is the only way that people should be eating, but that the research shows, especially the randomized controlled trials, show this is an effective intervention. I would say there's lots of associational data showing that plant-based diets are associated with improved health outcomes. There are fewer randomized controlled trials that have been done around this, but for example, one of the best randomized controlled trials we have is that PrediMed study that Kristin was talking about, and that was a balanced Mediterranean diet. So, I think we can take a lot of the tenets from these different things and present them to the client or patient and say, here's some different options. which one sounds more appealing, which one's going to fit into your own cultural food preferences, your food lifestyle per se, to show the benefit. But one of the things that lower glycemic eating will do is encourages more plant-based eating, just because of the nature of getting away from some of the processed foods, but instead eating more whole foods, because those tend to have lower glycemic load. Kristin, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would say that most of my patients, and we saw this in the case studies, most of them are actually moderate carbohydrate diets. So they're still a little lower in the glycemic load, but moderate carbohydrate, you're still getting in, let's say 40, even 45% based on the definition you're looking at for moderate carbs. So for my moderate carb patients, I have plenty that are vegetarian and very whole foods, very plant-based. So I think it's true. We have to figure out where is the patient, and then really the question is, where does the patient want to get their protein from? So if someone's more plant-based, that's a little more challenging because we're looking at more higher carb, but we can offset that in other areas, like maybe lower the whole grains a little bit. But definitely that's the bulk of my patients would be moderate carb Mediterranean, which again is primarily plant-based.
Perfect. Okay. So we're just a little bit after the hour. So I'm going to put the credit claiming slide up on the screen. If you have to leave us, we thank you for joining us, but we're going to take a couple more questions. We'll go a couple more minutes here. So for you, Kristin, from Maria, most nutrition counseling recommends small goals instead of entire meal plans or meal replacement. In the case, when you're thinking of it from the nutritional psychology perspective, do you go with small goals or do you give them plans and specific meal recommendations? What's your specific approach?
Totally small goals. I actually every week I do a presentation for, I think I mentioned this, for individuals that are going through an outpatient program for treatment of depression, anxiety, or trauma. And one of the things I said this week was, you guys are being asked to change so many things. I mean, here you are, you're going through therapy for whatever reason you're here for, and now I roll in and I ask you to change your diet as well. And that's a little overwhelming. So I think in the mental health patients, small goals is really critical. And I look at two different types of studies that we have in nutritional psychology. Number one is looking at just the addition of having an extra fruit or even one fruit or one vegetable a day and what that does to well-being. So we have some data on that. We also have data looking at, let's say, the SMILES trial, the AMEND trial, and the Health AMED trial. All are 12-week interventions with significant reductions in depression score and a Mediterranean approach. 12 weeks. So really we could take our time to look at what our dietary goals look like. So I think small goals is critical because these people are dealing with so many other factors. My presentation, just on an off topic, I suppose, today was all about the microbiome. And so my goal for the participants was, I said, listen, all I want you to do today is replace one food in your diet with something that has more prebiotics. And that might mean that instead of putting salt on something, you're going to season something with garlic that has prebiotic fiber. That's it. That's all I want you to do today. Or just look in your pantry and figure out, where do you have some really high hyperpalatable foods and what could we replace it with? Just choose one food. So I think that in order to reduce the overwhelmingness of making them change too many things at once, small goals is going to be really critical to long-term sustainability.
Great. All right, we have time for one more, and this one will be for both of you because I'm pretty sure, Dr. John, you probably have thoughts on the question. Do you recommend, or what are your thoughts on non-nutritive natural sweeteners, so those like that have erythritol, xylitol, or allulose, as an alternative to caloric sweeteners or non-nutritive artificial sweeteners? So I think the basis of the question is, what are your thoughts on non-nutritive natural sweeteners versus non-nutritive artificial sweeteners? Dr. John, I'll start with you.
Oh boy, how many hours do we have? It's a great question, and I think when we look at a lot of this data, a lot of it's confounded. So you see data showing consumption of artificial sweeteners or non-nutritive sweeteners in general being associated with some negative health outcomes. And what is pretty clear about that is that is probably reverse causality. So you have people who already have diabetes are actually trying to consume more diet soda, and therefore you're getting that data is getting confounded by that. what is pretty clear from the randomized controlled trials is that if you use these non-nutritive sweeteners to replace sugar-sweetened beverages, you see a benefit. Not adding a Diet Coke to your large, hamburger and triple French fry. So I think people tend to try to add a non-nutritive sweetener beverage to an already unhealthy meal. It's not going to help you when you do that, and that will further confound the data when you're looking at some of these health outcomes. There does seem to be some of these sugar alcohols like erythritol, xylitol. They're very metabolically inert, same with allulose. So those seem to be great, although I would say they've been around for a lot less time, so we don't quite have the full toxicology safety data that we have with some of the other non-nutritive sweeteners, things like the sucralose and other non-nutritive sweeteners. Kristin, do you want to add anything to non-nutritive sweeteners?
Well, I think the key for me, what I try and message to my patients, I think it really boils down to amount. And we do see that in the studies, right? I mean, I know there's been some studies lately that have looked at non-nutritive sweeteners, whether they're naturally based or not. And a lot of times what it boils down to is what is the amount that we're seeing in the studies related to maybe some adverse health outcomes. So I think, I give the example of a patient who might have coffee in the morning with some cream and they like to have a Splenda. And they don't really have Splenda anyplace else in their day. Is that really going to put them at risk, or is that helping them in terms of not getting the sugar? So it really does boil down to that for me. I'm always going to look at what does the whole dietary pattern look like? Do I think there's an excessive amount that's replacing maybe some other foods, or do I think it's maybe an appropriate amount and really helping that patient get through the goals that they're trying to achieve? And that can be really useful with non-nutritive sweeteners, is that it does provide some sweetness, which, we just talked for 60 minutes about how people really enjoy that. Sometimes it's hard for some of my patients to say, let's just go cold turkey and not have anything. So that could actually act as a crutch, but it really boils down to, is it moderate or is it excessive in my practice?
Perfect. Fantastic. That was a great way to end. And I just want to pause and say thank you guys. Thank you both so much. There was a lot of excitement about today's presentation, and we're so glad that you were here to share your expertise on this topic.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. It was a pleasure.
And as we always do at this point, let's talk about what's coming up next on the webinar calendar. We're going to fast forward about a little over a month from now, Tuesday, September 19th, from 2 to 3 p.m. Join Felicia Peraza for Teaching in Higher Education, How to Make Lessons Engaging and Inclusive. Felicia is going to discuss key skills dietitian educators can develop to include active listening, empathy, and compassion. And she'll share strategies on how to create a safe learning environment that honors diversity. Register for that one today at ce.todaysdietitian.com/higher-ed. And the credit claiming instructions are back on the screen for those of you still with us. You can also refer to the final page of the presentation handout for instructions on how to complete your evaluation and download your certificate. And with that, we've come to the end of the hour and then some. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and thank you to those who've stayed on for the Q&A. Thanks again, Dr. John and Kristin, and I wish all of you a happy day and a happy rest of your week.